Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a Friday Read type of update video. Most of the books that I'm going to talk about are going to end up being nonfiction, partially because it's Nonfiction November, but some of that is just a fluke of what I was reading at the end of October. However, the first thing that I talk about will be fiction. This is the Western Alienation Merit Badge by Nancy Jo Cullen. Despite the name and the cover, it does have recurring appearance by a Girl Guide handbook, but it is less guiding focused than you might think. The first third of this is set in 1982 and involves a 20-something woman who goes back to her father's house after her stepmother dies. She'd been living in Europe with a girlfriend and goes back to Alberta. Alberta in the early 80s seems to be a lot like Alberta now, which I guess is a commonality whenever the price of oil drops and the economy tanks out there. But of course the funny part is because Pierre Trudeau was in power at the time, it's still a lot of people complaining about a Trudeau, which I found hilarious. And people taking on mortgages that they probably shouldn't have. Some things just don't change in the cycle of that. In any case, this woman moves back in with her father and her sister. The sister is kind of a Catholic religious freak, and so there's some strain because the main character's childhood friend, who also becomes her friend with benefits, kind of moves in with them, and her sister is fairly homophobic, so there's some tension there. There's also the economic tension because the two sisters are working to help their father pay his mortgage because, again, economic crash. Then the middle third of this jumps between 2015 and 2017, and then we get a final third that is 1974 that's about the two sisters and this friend with benefits character as children. I liked a lot of the elements of this book. However, I thought the structure of it with those three distinct thirds didn't quite work. It would have been stronger if it had been much less grouped, if it was just random chapters together and it would jump between 74, 82, 15, 17, and so on. I think that would have been stronger, or I think it could have been stronger if it had been the 80s section, the 70s section, and then the modern day part at the very end, because the final chapter of that middle third feels like a conclusion, so that then when you have to go back to the 70s to get more, it feels like you're going backwards, and I didn't think that was the strongest choice. Still, that said, I thought this was reasonably entertaining, and I know there's often complaints about how much CanLit is set in Ontario, so if you're looking for something set in Alberta, here you go. Yeah, it was okay. Continuing on with Canadian material. I've now talked about this in a couple of the Nonfiction November videos that I did, but I finished reading Tanya Talaga's All Our Relations Finding a Way Forward, which is her entry in the CBC Massey Lecture series, in which she primarily is looking at the suicide epidemic in Indigenous populations in Canada, but she also takes a more international perspective and talks about numbers in Brazil and Norway and a bit in the United States and Australia as well. It is a lot less personal than Seven Fallen Feathers was, and I think that's obviously because it's taking this wider, broader picture. So in a lot of ways it's somewhat less immediately depressing than that because you're not connecting to individuals on the same level, but it is on a population level very depressing, but also important to know because I think a lot of people try to have dialogues around issues like that without looking at the broader picture, so I think it was definitely worth picking up for that. And I feel like because I talked about it in these two other videos, I don't have much else to say about it at this point. And actually, I think there's a readathon going on this month called the Indigathon, which encourages people to read Indigenous authors. I'll link to the announcement video that I saw for that below, because I did finish that on the 1st of November. That does count. Another book that would count for both that and Nonfiction November was I read a book that was on one of the last Canada Reads lists, The Right to Be Cold by Sheila Watt-Cloutier. She's both an Inuit activist and a climate change activist, and talks a lot about the intersections of those things, being that northern populations obviously are kind of at the forefront of experiencing things that happen as a result of climate change. And this is basically a memoir of her upbringing in this northern community in the 50s and 60s during a time of a lot of social change, as well as a memoir of her work in political activism and in climate change circles. It's probably about twice as long as it needed to be. I feel like an editor should have cut back on some of what's in here because her story is very compelling and her advocacy work is very important, but she gets into a lot of the kind of side pieces. There's a certain amount of resentment of her work being glossed over when she was doing some things with Al Gore, who was recognized more, which I think is, you know, expected just in a global picture of here's a American politician and they're just going to get more publicity globally, which is unfortunate, but so much focus on that element I think took away from some of the broader pictures in here. Still, either way, even though I thought it could have been a lot shorter, I did think it was well worth reading. If you are interested in kind of social change in northern communities in the mid-20th century, or in climate change activism, because there is a lot of interesting stuff about both of those things in here. Next up, I read a very practical book, and that was Move Your DNA by Katy Bowman. When I mentioned this book before, I mentioned that I was wondering if it was going to be more about biomechanics or more about kind of new agey stuff. It is definitely biomechanics. It is aimed pretty squarely at a more American audience because it talks about a lot of the tips in here are things that are very wedded to specifically American lifestyle. It is presented as kind of lifestyles in developed nations, but I don't 100% believe that just because one of the big things is that people should stop wearing shoes at home, and I feel like that's an American thing, maybe a British thing. People in most countries don't wear shoes in their house. Like in Canada, that would be rude if you were wearing shoes in somebody's house. There's also a lot of stuff about squatting, and humans don't squat enough, and based on the elderly people that I see on my walks doing their gardening, people from most parts of the world do still squat, at least within a couple of generations. I think it's very kind of American thing that they don't. I do feel like when I lived in Houston, you would see old people bending over instead of squatting. But still, I do think there's a general usefulness to her pointing out that there are a lot of movements like sitting at a desk and wearing shoes that are limiting the general functionality of a lot of people's joints. And I was impressed that at a couple of points she does point out some movement restrictions that legitimately would prevent people from doing the things that she says in there, and I think that's something that a lot of guides like this would be missing, so I appreciated that she included that. In any case, I was just curious to read this, so while I am complaining that it's a little more basic and a little more US-centric than I would have liked, it definitely satisfied my curiosity. I do think if there is a flaw in this for the target market that it's aimed at, it would be that there aren't enough pictures of some of the movements that she talks about. I think there could have been a little bit more of that. But either way, I did think this was pretty well done, although I don't know that you would get anything out of this that you wouldn't get from reading her blog. But if you prefer to read things in a physical form, there you go. As usual, I also have been listening to a couple of audiobooks, one of which I didn't particularly like and ended up having on while not really listening to it, and that was Amber Tamblyn's Error of Ignition. I went into that expecting it to be proportionally more about her movement from being a child actress to being a film director, with some peripheral feminist commentary, but it is instead a very Feminism 101 guidebook with the career stuff being secondary, and I just didn't feel like she was the person that I wanted to hear that kind of thing from. And it was a bit weird to me because as someone who was a child actress who has famous family members, she's in a position of career and financial benefit that doesn't get acknowledged, even though she acknowledges a lot of the race and language and ethnicity pieces. And I feel like if you acknowledge that and not the career class bits, I felt like there was a gap in that, and I resented listening to her do these lectures. So I think there is probably an audience for that, of people who are bigger fans of her as opposed to just being curious about her career progression, which I was. So it may be that I'm just not the right audience for that one, but I didn't appreciate having her lecture me about feminism. But you may enjoy that more than I would, depending on how you feel about her voice. I did think it was interesting because her husband is a comedian who's been called out on things before, and she addresses some of that, which I did think was kind of interesting. But I'm also currently listening to another audiobook, Stringer, A Reporter's Journey in the Congo by Anjan Sundaram, which is narrated by Shah, and somewhat distractingly, Shah does not have the same accent that the author does, so I always find that slightly distracting when I'm aware of something like that, but I have mostly gotten over it. This is an interesting piece of, I would say, kind of narrative journalism. It's not straight reportage. It's in part, I was going to say memoir, but almost travelogue. It's really interesting because the author was a mathematician in grad school in the US, although he grew up in the Emirates, who after he finished his master's degree, just decided he was going to move to Congo and report. And so it's kind of a fascinating journey through this experience, because he went not sponsored by any organization or any company. So he was living in areas that reporters normally wouldn't, and not just reporters, but that foreigners often wouldn't, because he talks about interacting with the South Asian community in Congo, or with the just general expat community in Congo, and they're all shocked by where he lives. So he has a very different experience than a lot of people would. He is in Kinshasa in this, and I've had some friends and family who have lived in Congo, but always either sponsored by a company or because they had a local wife and were, you know, staying with family. So this is a very different portrait of a foreigner living in Congo that is, it kind of bridges the gap of things that you read from locals and things that you read from the more standard foreigner or expat experience. So it's interesting and it's compelling listening, as long as you can get past the accent piece between the actual author and the narrator. That's been my week and a half, 2 weeks. I can't remember when the last time I did one of these was, actually. In any case, if you've read any of these, I'd love to hear what you thought of them. And I'd also be curious to hear if you are distracted by differences in narrator versus author accents in audiobooks the way I am. Anyway, that's it for now. Have a good weekend. Ciao.